So having been an offset guitar tech and specialist here in New York City for the past 15 plus years, I'll often get DMs from folks who are either new owners of a Jazzmaster or Jaguar, or folks who've had them for years but have always struggled to get them dialed in properly. And their questions almost always pertain to very common issues that they are having with their offset guitars. So today I figured I'd run down some of the most common mistakes that people make when they have a Jazzmaster and Jaguar, and how to finally get those sorted out so that you have the best playing and sounding experience that you can possibly have with your Jazzmaster or Jaguar. So we're going to start off with something fairly boring, and that is proper stringing of a Jazzmaster or Jaguar. It's the same for both, and you can check out the link on how to properly string a Fender guitar that has these vintage style tuners. But in a nutshell, basically what you'll want to do with your E, A, and D strings is to pull them taut up to the post that you want to string up, right? And then cut the string 2 posts away. So if you are stringing up the E, you want to pull that taut and then cut over here at the D, so on and so forth. Now, when you get to the G string, you'll want to pull that G string taut, pinch at the G post, pull that back, and then cut at your high E post, okay? And then your B and your E strings, you don't cut at all usually. Now, choosing the proper string gauge is really important. And if you have been, living on forums like offsetguitars.com or Reddit or any one of the number of Facebook offset-centric groups, you'll see people commonly recommending 11 gauge strings to folks, whether you own a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar. And that is my preferred and recommended spec too, but that does not mean that you can't step down in gauges. I've had string gauges as low as 9s work on a Jazzmaster, and even surprisingly, a Jaguar, so long as you get the rest of the setup dialed in right. Now, choosing what brand of strings is also important, because I have found over the many years that I've been doing this that there are some strings that are perfect. For example, the Gabriel Tenorio offset guitar strings for both the Jazzmaster and Jaguar. These are specifically handmade for these models that have the vibratos installed. They have extra long reinforced winds at the ball ends and come in both these pure nickel as well as the silk wrapped variants, which help folks who are struggling with some of the metallic, unwanted, behind the bridge stuff that some folks get driven crazy by. I personally love that stuff, but if you are struggling with it, the Gabriel Tenorio Artist Series strings, which have the silk wraps, are the ones to get. If you are on a budget, my favorite strings are just your plain old Diodario nickel wound XLs. The Pro Steels and the New York XLs are also fantastic. But for me, the strings to avoid, and I know this is me putting the kibosh on potentially getting any type of sponsorship from them, but I would avoid Ernie Ball, like your normal slinky style strings, as much as possible. I find those ones are the easiest and most common to break. The treble strings, and especially the B and E strings, are unfortunately too short to be adequate and often result, again, in string breakage. Now, let's move on to the topic of shimming. And in case you do not know what shimming is, it basically is the practice of adding a material, whether that be, a full pocket wooden veneer, like those that you can get from StewMac, or plastic, like some people like to use just guitar picks, for example. And Fender, over the years, has used fiberboard and sometimes even just pieces of cardstock and you basically put them in the inner neck pocket here so that it is touching the bottom portion of the neck pocket behind the neck mounting screws. And what that does is it gives you the ability to angle your neck backwards, which then gives you the ability to raise your bridge. Now, vintage style guitars and even the American vintage reissue series and Japanese Fenders from the 90s into the 2000s all came with flat, vintage accurate neck pockets, which required a shim to get that appropriate amount of pitchback. When you do not have shims installed or you remove the factory installed shims, what ends up happening is that for you to have comfortable action, your bridge is sitting a bit too low, sometimes even flush against the pickguard, which kills your sustain and the resonance of your instrument, and also just leads to tuning stability issues, floppy feeling strings. I mean, I could go on and on. So in those instances, if you have a flat neck pocket, you definitely want to start. My baseline recommendation is to start with probably about 0.5 millimeters worth of shim. I commonly will just use cardstock as my favorite shimming material. And then from there, you are able to then raise your bridge, and that will increase the string tension and the sustain and resonance, as well as the break angle behind the bridge, while still allowing you to dial in low action. Now, there are instances where you do not want to shim, and honestly, from 2012 onwards, a lot of the Jazzmaster and Jaguar models that Fender has been putting out already have angled neck pockets from the factory. Starting from the American Vintage 65 series, models like those, as well as the Johnny Marr Jaguar or the American original 60s Jazzmasters and Jaguars, as well as the more recent American Vintage 2, all have angled neck pockets. The Squier Classic Vibe series offsets also have angled neck pockets, but I have found them to be a little bit inconsistent. So one very basic rule of thumb is that if your bridge, from the base of the bridge down to the lip of the thimbles, and sometimes I'll also use the pick guard as a reference point, if that is lower than about 2 millimeters, then you likely are going to want to add a little bit of shim to it, even if you have an angled neck pocket. Now, the reverse issue exists where sometimes the neck pocket is a little too angled from the factory, resulting in you having to set your bridge a little bit too high. And in those instances, if you want to dial that bridge back down a bit, you're going to need to employ a reverse shim, which is when you put a shim instead towards the outer end of the neck pocket, which in effect, instead of tilting your neck backwards, is going to tilt it somewhat forwards, making it more straight and allowing you to then lower your bridge. If you just got an offset guitar, definitely Google or check out forums like Offset Guitars to see if your model already has an angled neck pocket, and also go ahead and check to see what the bridge height is set to when you first get it. Because one of the issues that I will commonly see from folks are when they have like overloaded themselves with information in preparation for getting their first offset, and they go and try to like pick off their little to-do list of all of the things that they've read they have to do, and the end result that I've seen people do is throwing like a 1 degree shim in an American original 60s Jaguar, which then resulted in having the bridge set a bit too high, something like 9-10 millimeters, which is just way too much. The string tension is too much. It increases the likelihood of you breaking strings and having tuning instability issues. So yeah, definitely make sure to see whether the model that you have is already angled from the factory. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the setup of guitars that have the vibrato moved up and the bridges are tune-o-matic or adjust-o-matic bridges need to be treated differently than what I've mentioned for these more vintage accurate style Jazzmasters and Jaguars. Now, with those, you definitely do not want to be adding excess shims because the design of those guitars is intended for those tune-o-matics to be pretty low profile. If you add too much shims to those kinds of guitars, which already have an increased amount of break angle behind the bridge because of the moved up vibrato, you are going to experience tuning instability issues, string breakage, because the saddles on those tune-o-matic or adjust-o-matic bridges have these really sharp V-style slots on them. So definitely make sure to try to adjust your bridge and action and truss rod tension first on those guitars before you start experimenting with shims, because again, those have already been designed to address those issues, and you adding shims after the fact can unfortunately result in problems that you likely don't want to deal with. Now, while we're still on the topic of the bridge, I wanted to talk very briefly about that general rule of thumb that I just shared regarding bridge height. And that applies, in my experience, to both the original threaded saddle bridge or Mustang style bridges, and even the Mastery bridge or other modern bridges like the Belrok, the Hallen, the Descendant Companion bridge. All of those kinds of bridges, I feel, do benefit from being at least 2.5 to 3 millimeters high. That is, again, from base of the bridge down to the pickguard or the top of the thimbles. Now, one of the common issues that I will hear from folks who recently upgraded their bridge to something more modern, like a Mastery or this Belrok bridge here, is that for whatever reason, they are getting noises and like creaking sounds from these strings pulling on the saddles because these kinds of bridges are locked. They do not rock when you use the vibrato system. In those instances, they more often than not are because the bridges have been set too high, likely because they have over shimmed the guitars. And so either dialing back the shims or removing the shims completely if you do have a factory angled neck pocket often solves those issues. Another related thing to that common problem is that folks have the misconception that adjusting the little spring tension screw here in the vibrato is for you to actually dial the height of the tremolo arm, and that unfortunately is not actually the case. I have seen folks max this thing out so that this collet here is sitting over an inch proud of the vibrato plate, and that is going to cause serious issues from too much string tension. That is just not how that collet and tension spring for the vibrato was designed to work. Now, in case you didn't know, Leo Fender had actually designed this lock here to be able to bring the rest of your strings back to pitch should you break a string during a performance or maybe a recording session or something. And if set up properly, once that lock is engaged and that is locked away from the bridge, typically you will have to depress the arm slightly and then lock, and you'll know that it's properly locked because you can't actually pull the vibrato arm up anymore. And so that is actually the purpose of that lock, and it's not really for anything else. Obviously, players can set their guitars to however which way they want to based on the features that it has. But if you improperly set these things because you think that they serve a different purpose, then unfortunately they can lead to issues. Now, continuing with other issues related to the bridge, if you've been on the forums, you've probably likely seen people recommending the use of Loctite 242 Blue, which is a thread locker that folks will commonly use to address everything from bridges lowering themselves over time because the little grubs that adjust the height of the bridge sink back into the legs from having wildly inconsistent tolerances, and they are loose, and the vibrations from you playing end up resulting in those little grubs recessing back into the bridge. The Loctite Blue is also used to address rattles and unwanted noises coming from the little grubs to adjust the saddle heights, especially if you have variable radius bridges like the original threaded saddle bridge or even the mastery bridge. The one thing that I do want to say that folks don't often mention is that a little bit of this goes a really long way. The way that I personally like to apply this is by taking this and dripping a bit of it onto a Q-tip and then literally just dabbing one side of the little grub or screw that you are hoping to apply this on. And that really is all it takes, because once you thread that screw back in, this thread locker is going to spread and coat the inner walls of either the bridge posts or the saddles, and that is all you need. If you go ham with this stuff and you start to completely dunk your little grubs and screws with this, you are going to have an incredibly difficult time readjusting those screws after the thread locker has set. So that is a bit of a warning for you. A little bit goes a long way. You do not need to go crazy with this stuff. Apply only a little bit at a time, and make sure to avoid getting this stuff in the little hole intended for you to insert the hex or Allen key into, because this stuff will harden up and you will have a incredibly difficult time digging this stuff back out so that you can actually adjust those grubs again. Now, another thing related to the bridge that folks commonly make mistakes over is when it comes to locking the bridge. Now, folks who are frustrated by the fact that their original rocking bridges, whether they be this original threaded saddle bridge or a Mustang style bridge, even well set up Jaguars and Jazzmasters, over time will have those rocking bridges shift forward or backwards in the thimbles, and that can result in throwing off your intonation. It can result in increased vibrations and noises that will sound to folks like fret buzz, when in reality it's coming from the bridge. So some folks recommend taping the bridge down, so long as you have something that is a Mustang bridge style or saddles that have actual grooves in them and not like this threaded saddle bridge. It is totally fine to lock down the bridge so that it doesn't move. Now, if you do end up locking down your bridge, or the type of bridge you're using is designed to be locked, and you're having issues because there is a friction point at the saddles or the nut, make sure you use some lubrication in the slots. Now, my go-to for doing that over the years has been to use products like Big Ben's nut sauce, which comes in a little syringe with a really fine tip, making it easy for you to apply. And recently I have been trying out this Music Nomad Tune It, and includes two of these handy little applicators to help you get that job done easily. Now, if you do have one of these original threaded saddle bridge and you have it rocking, you do not want to apply this kind of stuff at the saddles, because the whole point of the design of the original threaded saddle bridge is that it provides a friction point so that when you use the vibrato, the strings effectively pull the the bridge back and forth. If you have one of these kinds of bridges, definitely skip lubing up the saddles and just lube up the nut slots instead. Now, we spoke a bit earlier about the vibrato tension spring and not to try to use it to set the tremolo arm or vibrato arm height, but I didn't get into how to actually set this thing up. So basically, to set this thing up properly, you want to set the tension spring via this screw here so that a half turn counterclockwise results in you being able to lock the trem or set the trem lock without first depressing the arm, right? Once you find that point, set it back again, a half turn clockwise. And at that point, you should not be able to lock the trem lock without first depressing the arm. I'll be making a dedicated video on that in the future to show you the details of how to get that done, because I understand that that is somewhat of a challenging concept to understand, but that is the way that Leo Fender had designed this vibrato to be set up. Now, in the case that you have a Squier vintage modified or classic vibe or the mastery or the descendant, one that just doesn't feature a trem lock, then the general rule of thumb is that I set the collet to be about a half inch to 3/4 of an inch proud of the vibrato plate, starting off with that setting and then experimenting to see what is the most stable is usually how I go about it on those kinds of units. The biggest problem, especially with the Squiers, is that from the factory, the tension springs are set just a bit too high. And so again, that leads to tuning instability. So if you're having issues with it on your guitar, definitely check to see how high it is currently and then dial it back using those general guidelines. So long as you've got the rest of the things that I've mentioned here done and set up properly, the only other thing that you're going to want to check is that your nut slots have the appropriate width and depth and also angle to them to make sure that you are not binding at the nut. A very easy way to tell if your strings are binding at the nut is to just grab the string and lift. If you hear a little click because it is getting stuck at the nut, that means that you're binding. And at that point, the slots of your nut are basically pinching the string. So when you are playing or when you are using the vibrato, that string is not allowed to freely move because the nut slot is a bit too narrow usually. And even lubing up the nut slot is not going to fix that. So if you do not have the experience using professional nut files, I highly advise you to take your Jazzmaster or Jaguar to a qualified tech to open those up. This is a very, very common issue, particularly with your imported Jazzmasters and Jaguars, whether that be Squier or even Fender Japan. Some of these guitars come with 9 to 42 gauge strings from the factory, and trying to put on a set of 11s is unfortunately a bit too much of a step up for the factory done nut slots. So they will need to be widened. On that point, another issue that folks will commonly have is experiencing a sitar-like sound and resonance from a string. And more often than not, that issue is being caused by not only binding at the nut, but also a nut slot that is cut too flat and without having that angle at the back end of the nut slot. When done properly, the back half of a nut slot should angle down towards the tuning posts. And if it is too straight, that unfortunately ends up resulting in those unwanted sitar noises. So again, if you have nut slotting files, that is a very, very easy fix. If not, bring it to a qualified guitar tech. And lastly, let's just talk about setting the truss rod. Now, a lot of these Jazzmasters and Jaguars come with truss rod adjustments at the heel, requiring you to have to unscrew the neck from the body and adjust. You definitely want to make sure to only adjust the nut a quarter turn at a time and then reinstall and check. Remember that Fender's recommendation for the amount of relief that you have in your neck is 30 thousandths of an inch from the top of the 8th fret to the bottom of both your low E and high E strings after capoing the 1st fret and depressing the last fret. That is how you properly check the amount of relief that you have if you don't have fancier gauges and things. And so if you have a string action gauge, such as those that you can find from StewMac or even cheaper ones that you can find on Amazon, you can check to see if you have an appropriate amount of relief, because having too much relief is going to make your action feel high. And a lot of times, if you had your guitar professionally set up over time, I feel like folks tinker a little bit too much with all of the other things like your bridge and your saddles and all of that stuff, when really over time the thing that is most likely to change is your truss rod tension. So definitely, before you start finagling with everything else, check to see that your truss rod has the appropriate amount of relief. Remember that too much relief is going to result in your neck feeling like the action is too high, and too little relief, when your neck is bowing upwards towards the strings, is going to result in nasty fret buzz and stuff. And that's not what you want. Now, one more thing that I wanted to bring up about the vibrato, and a common mistake and issue folks have, is that they will rush to upgrade the vibrato, even though they have a fine working one, like ones from the Fender Japan guitars or even the American Vintage Reissue series, because they have a loosey-goosey vibrato arm. So folks will spend an unnecessary amount of money and wait exorbitant amounts of time for, a stay trem collet, for example, which can take upwards of 12 plus weeks for you to get, or will upgrade to like a mastery vibrato because they are sick of that trem arm swinging wildly. Well, it's actually a pretty easy fix. One very common method is to put the vibrato arm in a vise and then hit the very bottom end with a hammer to give it a little bit of a kink. And what that does is that it gives it a little bend at the end, which helps it to better hug the walls of the vibrato collet here. And when I do something like that, or even using a set of monkey pliers and a little cloth here so as to not mar up the chrome finish, I will a lot of times just take this thing like this here, and from the very bottom end, just give it a bit of muscle and elbow grease and just bend up ever so slightly. And that's usually enough to give it a slight bend. If you can see there, it's bending a little bit that way. And before I now install this into a vibrato unit, I will usually lubricate this a bit to ensure that you have smooth movement with as little friction as possible, despite having a trem arm or vibrato arm that will stay wherever you leave it. Anyway, I think that about does it for this video. I hope it was helpful, especially if you've been having issues with your Jazzmaster or Jaguar. Obviously, for a video as short as this, I will not be able to cover every single issue that you all might have experienced on your own guitars. So if there's something that I've forgotten to mention that you would like for me to bring up and cover in a future installment of this series, make sure to comment down below. I would love to hear it. If you haven't already, do please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as that notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. It helps this teeny tiny channel to grow. And as always, don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars setup tips.